This episode discusses topics that may be sensitive for some listeners. These topics include eating disorders, body image struggles, exercise addiction, trauma, and fertility challenges. If these topics are triggering for you, please listen with care or seek support from a trusted professional. Welcome. I'm Harmony Slater, your host of the Finding Harmony podcast. Over the past 20 years, I've taught thousands of yoga teachers and students to explore the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern everyday life, using mind-body practices to heal, awaken, and manifest their dreams from the inside out. This podcast is a sanctuary for those feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. Are you ready to jump in and discover how these challenges aren't actually in the way, but are the way to finding harmony? Let's invite the magic back in. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm so excited you're here today because we are delving into the fascinating world of psychodynamic psychotherapy with Kate Winter, who is a registered psychodynamic counselor based in Brighton and Hove. And if you have been with us for a while, you might remember Kate as a past guest. You can go back into the archives and listen to her story, her journey, her own personal journey. It's called A Delicious Poison. It's one of our earlier episodes. But today we are going to talk to Kate about her unique perspective to therapeutic work, which combines her extensive experience in trauma-informed care and also her deep understanding of the mind-body connection based on her own work that she's done through years of yoga practice and yoga study, as well as therapy, her own being in therapy for many years, and her journey working with the police service. She was a police detective for many years, and she also worked and served women in a rape crisis center, helping them navigate their paths to healing. And so Kate's approach is particularly intriguing given her background and her experience as a yoga teacher and personal trainer, and how she's combining all of this Eastern philosophy and practice with a more traditional psychodynamic therapeutic approach. And so she can understand that stories aren't just held in our minds, but they are also held in our bodies as well. And so we're going to have this wonderful conversation today about somatic experience and how it links with her studies and her understanding about psychodynamic therapy. So if you are curious about therapy or personal growth, or simply fascinated by the complexities and the mysteries of human psychology and the human mind and consciousness, then I'm sure you're going to love this episode because we're going to shine a light on how we can better understand ourselves and our relationships. So let's jump in. Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Harmony, and I am so excited to jump into this conversation. It is going to be such a good one because I am here with my dear friend, Kate Winter. Hello, beautiful. How are you?
I'm good, Harmony. So nice to see you.
So much has changed since the last time we spoke. I mean, the last time you were on the podcast, we were talking about your story, your history. It was called A Delicious Poison, for those of you who want to cycle back maybe 3 years ago, I think, to that episode. But let's just do a brief recap. Tell me in 2 minutes how you got to where you are right now sitting in front of me.
Yeah, I'll try and do that in 2 minutes. So, Harmony, I was trying to think this morning, like when we met, and I think we met in Iceland and it was 2018.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I must have been about maybe 2 years into regular Ashtanga practice, although I'd learnt the method a few years prior to that. I had been, and I think we covered this in the last podcast, I was a detective in the police in my 20s, did that for 10 years. And during that time was a marathon runner, that very type A, tough chick persona. And then I left that because it was incredibly bad for me and I was skinny as a rake and suffering from all sorts of disordered eating and life's difficulties. But of course I thought, well, I have to put weight on. I'm going to put a load of muscle on and that will be how I'll deal with that. So I then started competing in bodybuilding, just changed one extreme sort of sport for another. And needless to say, and because I'm keeping this short, I then ended up realizing this isn't healthy for me either. But obviously, if I'm going to just do yoga, and I say just in inverted commas, of course it has to be Ashtanga. And I mean, Ashtanga was the first type of practice that I had ever learned. It was the only yoga class I'd ever been to. And obviously it's incredibly intense. And so I embarked on this daily practice as we do. As I say, I think I met you in Iceland and have traveled to meet you many times since then. I've left the police force, I had some time working in fitness and teaching some yoga before now working as a psychotherapist.
Incredible.
So it's been a bit of a journey.
What I know from knowing you, but also just from what you've spoken about here, is there's obviously something in your personality that is very driven, very A-type, and also probably very into intensity in all forms.
Absolutely. I mean, Ayurvedically speaking, it's the pitta, isn't it? I have a lot of fire and heat and passion, but that can quite easily just go into this sort of extreme. I've always been that way, even as a child. If I liked something, I would be obsessed with it. And I've certainly had that approach to things in life, which on the one hand has made me quite good at things. But on the other hand, you have that sort of attitude of it's never good enough. There's always more, and competitiveness with the self and others. So learning to moderate that is a life's practice, I think.
For many of us. How do we first notice these patterns of competition or self-depreciation that are maybe driving that ambition or that needing to prove yourself or that feeling like it's never enough? I need to go further. I need to work harder. I need to do more. And I think that's underlying a lot of the extreme aspects of many of the things that you talked about. I mean, when you were a bodybuilder, you weren't just like working out. You were in competitions and winning awards. When you're doing Ashtanga yoga, you're like on your mat 6 days a week, practicing hard, doing the full thing, and then really looking at those patterns. And I suspect the journey of therapy and going into psychotherapy and becoming a psychotherapist yourself had you do a lot of that deeper work around what exactly is driving this sort of intensity in your life.
Absolutely. And I was fortunate in the sense that the extremities led me to be so underweight that I had a lot of support from eating disorder services, and that included and involved having psychotherapy. And so I've now had therapy for, probably more than 12 years. And I continue to have therapy myself now. And I personally believe that all good therapists should have a therapist and, or at least have spent a good time in therapy themselves. Really getting to know one's own sort of ego is a really big sort of part of that sort of discovery and knowing where that comes from. But of course, the yoga teaches us that as well. And some philosophy also teaches us that or tries to teach us that. And I suppose the danger with just practicing asana, or at least, especially with Ashtanga, that is very driven and there are these kind of rules around the 6-day practice and you do the whole thing, etc., etc. And I think this is what we meant by delicious poison. It's something that can be so incredibly healing, but it can also reinforce the samskaras or the patterns that we have. And I think that I personally needed both the yoga and everything that yoga contains in terms of the 8 limbs, but also the psychotherapeutic aspect in order to shine a light on the nature of myself.
Yeah, I love that. I love that insight. Both Buddhism and yoga are really like philosophies for living, but they're not necessarily doing that deeper emotional healing therapeutic work in a way. And yes, there's somatic practices, the meditation, the asana can help you to repattern or feel into some of what we're holding in our body. But sometimes, often, we have to actually slow down and sit down and do some of that reflective look, which is a part of Swadhyaya, of course. It's part of the 8 limbs. But you can't really do it alone, I don't think. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, I would agree. Part of my own journey, I suppose, has been coming to understand that I need other people. And I very much had what my therapist said to me once, a pathological self-sufficiency. And I just believed that I needed to be by myself and that I just needed to do my practice and I could run my life like this perfectly organized sort of machine. And I think being with another in therapy has really opened me up to this knowing, not just a belief, but a knowing that I need the mind of other people. And actually, other people have really great minds that I can use and borrow. And isn't that amazing that actually, like, someone else might have a thought that I've not had, and that could be useful to me. So I think much like seeing a yoga teacher, even if it's not every day that you practice with the teacher, actually going on retreat or going to see a teacher or going to practice Mysore sporadically, having that input from someone else has been really valuable to me. And I'm not sure that I would have come to some of the realizations, because I'm not a finished product, but some of those realizations had I just sat by myself and read Buddhist texts, yogic texts, or indeed psychotherapeutic texts. I think I needed to be in the presence of someone and to really feel that connection.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to is really important, because also there's something implicit and maybe duplicit in that feeling or that sense that you can just do it all by yourself and you don't need anyone, and I'm just on my spiritual path and I'm growing and learning. It's really a protection mechanism, and it's protecting you from ever having to be vulnerable or ever having to really reveal that you don't have it together or you're not perfect or things are falling apart.
Yeah.
And something kind of magical. I mean, the real transformation of yoga, like spiritual growth and development, actually starts to happen when we can allow ourselves to soften into that vulnerability, I think.
Absolutely. And I think this knowing that I don't have to be strong all the time has been a revelation in my life. And I think that obviously with marathon training and then bodybuilding and being a cop, it was all about proving to the world and to myself that I am strong. And actually knowing that vulnerability is a part of that has been really important. But I suppose, again, it's thinking about the asana in the same way of, if you just muscle your way into everything, I mean, you can't muscle your way into everything. You just simply can't. There has to be that balance. And I suppose that's something that I continue to work on, is actually how strong do I need to be, and actually how soft do I need to be, and whether that's physically or emotionally. They seem to speak to one another anyway. The more physically soft I become, the more emotionally soft I seem to become, and vice versa.
Yeah. It's so interesting, always finding that balance. I love this resistance that comes up in us. I was sitting in a meeting with Prune Harris, who does a lot of energy work and energy healing. She's actually English, living in Cornwall. And someone was saying when they were tuning into their body, they were experiencing like a feeling of resistance, or they didn't want to do the practices. They didn't want to do these somatic practices. And her response was so beautiful. And it just reminded me of the power of softness. And she was like, she says, resistance is such a beautiful energy. It's such a strong energy. And just welcome it. If you don't want to do the practice, don't do the practice. But just be with that resistance and enjoy the resistance and welcome it. It was reminded me of the power, the strength in the softness. And I think sometimes, especially in the Ashtanga tradition, we have a habit of meeting resistance with resistance, and meeting ourselves with resistance, where we're like muscling our way, as you say, or white knuckling our way through a series of postures or practices instead of allowing that softness. Or if we're feeling resistant, allowing the resistance and welcoming that energy. It's a very kind of different way of being with oneself than I think most of us are taught growing up. And I'm curious, what is the approach with even psychotherapy? Like, how does it deal with this kind of resistance or meeting these different parts of ourselves that maybe are at war within?
Well, I think what you say is really interesting, because when you were speaking, I was thinking about times when, you're on the mat and you experience resistance and you have this feeling that you're just supposed to allow it to be, and you're supposed to just notice and almost bypass the part of you that's really judgmental about yourself for your resistance.
Yeah, you're judging the judgment.
Yeah, and that's another thing to notice. Yeah. And I think we can get trapped in that cycle of being so in the head still whilst doing these embodied somatic practices and judging everything that kind of comes up. And in psychotherapy, certainly the way that I work with clients is everything is welcome and everything is data. Everything has a meaning behind it. And I know that in my own therapy, I've literally told my therapist to F off. I've been angry and I've said, just, you can go and F yourself. And you feel terrible because you're like, oh my God, this poor person. But I think being able to take those rageful parts, I think rage, especially for women, is something that we feel very ashamed about or very difficult about. And I think that certainly rage and even for me, it's sadness and that vulnerability in that way, being able to take that to another, and they're these very primitive, usually quite infantile feelings. If you just talk about them, which I've certainly done this for years in therapy, just been very good at talking about them, but not really showing them to the other person. I think you only ever get to a certain level of healing. It's like talking about doing asana, but like you can talk about doing a sun salutation, but unless you do it, you haven't done it. And this is about safety, I think, or at least trust, being able to be in the presence of another and show them your absolute worst bits, and for them to still love you or accept you or receive that is very healing, I think. And hopefully that's then what can happen in relationships outside of the consulting room as well, is that we can have relationships with other people where sometimes we're a complete bitch, but that's okay.
Yeah, I love that. That's really powerful too. I think that is part of the healing, right? Is just being able to reveal yourself, which does require a level of vulnerability and safety, and allow yourself to be seen and allow someone to hold that acceptance, which is part of what we're constantly seeking, I think, through all of these activities and achievements and all the things that are driving us, right? It's this self-acceptance, of course, that we're seeking, but we often find that in our interactions with another as well.
Yeah. And that of parents. I think that even if someone's parents have passed or they're estranged, these early relationships are just so interesting and instrumental in how people then go on to seek approval, recognition, love, validation. And all of that comes up through a practice such as Ashtanga or many other sporting and academic type achievements too.
Yeah. A lot of people I notice sometimes that leave the practice or go away from it or change into a different type of practice. All of that is fine. But what I find interesting is that we often blame the thing we were doing. And like I could have, for example, we'll set yoga to one side, but I was dancing for a long time as a ballet dancer, very intensely, 6 days a week, constantly training, mind just like one pointed focus, anorexia, bulimia, like all the things in pursuit of the ideal body, the ideal performance or shape, and all of the ideal weight, all the things that go along with that culture. And when I quit dancing, I could have looked back and said, oh, well, dancing, ballet's the problem. And of course, there's a lot of maybe unhealthy cultural sort of norms that are embedded there. But it's almost just that the environment fostered something that was already a seed within me, because not everyone has that experience. And so it's rather than blaming the thing or blaming even the practice, oh, Ashtanga yoga creates competitiveness or it creates injury, or it creats, I don't know, addiction or obsessive compulsive disorder, which potentially there's maybe some cultural sort of ethos there that could perpetuate or promote that kind of seed. But the seed has to actually be there. And that's really what it's pointing us to. It's showing us maybe where we need to do the work, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that when I look back, I have no regrets that Ashtanga was the very first form of yoga that I learnt. And of course it was. I mean, when I went to an Ashtanga yoga class, I didn't know what Ashtanga yoga was. I just thought, oh, I'm running a marathon, I should do some yoga. And this class that I went to was called Ashtanga. And it just happened to then be primary series, and I was destroyed on the floor. But I think that I certainly don't look back and think, oh, I wish I had learnt a kind of hatha yoga or something arguably more gentle, because I think I needed to have this intense practice for a period of time to shine that light on the seed, as you describe it, in order for me to then find something in myself that I didn't know was there. And being honest, I've only recently found it, which is the discernment to know that, okay, all these people might be doing these things. And Patabi Joyce, who I never met, might have said all these things before he passed away. But actually, I have this beautiful method, and I have learnt what is best for me within that method. And sometimes that might not be practicing 6 days a week or doing the whole practice.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think at the beginning we need the structure, and also you need to resonate with something. And probably if you had gone to a yin class as your first Ashtanga yoga class, you might have been like, fuck this, I don't want to do this boring kind of yoga, right? You might not have done yoga at all or gone and found Ashtanga anyway, because there needs to be like that resonance, that connection with whatever it is you're doing. And attracts like. I mean, that's your basic Ayurvedic principle. So we're going to be naturally attracted to the things that are reflective of our whatever's happening for us internally, energetically, mentally, emotionally, physically. But then what you're speaking to, I think, is learning the structure, entering into the form. But then, as Bruce Lee says, we need to exit the form. And that's real mastery, is when you start to then use the form in a way that is connected to what you need and to yourself, rather than sacrifice yourself on the altar of the form.
Sure.
Yeah.
The structure is important, because creativity can only really happen within form, within structure. But it's a shame if creativity is then inhibited because of the form and the structure. So I think as Ashtangis, and probably as humans, we're always doing that dance between how much have I let go of the form, that actually it's now becoming something that looks a little bit formless and feels a bit formless. But how much have I really drank the Kool-Aid, and I'm now not even allowing myself to do an extra hip opener because it's not in the sequence.
That's right. Heaven forbid you do pigeon.
I know. I mean, I've been told off for doing pigeon or doing little extras. So
Yeah. So funny. Okay, let's talk about, so psychotherapy is a little bit, I mean, it's based on Freud, and then also I think the work of Jung as well, right? Carl Jung, who is, I mean, masterful at metaphors and archetypes, and the great-grandfather of all of that work that we're still very much connected to. What insights do you think that it can bring to our lives as yoga practitioners? Like, if I was just practicing yoga and had no real idea about psychotherapy or understanding myself in this kind of new way, what would I discover if I came into a psychotherapy session and was like talking about my shame around practice? I don't know.
Well, I suppose it's a very direct way of getting to manas, into the mind in a way that is shared with another person. And I think that often when I've read classic psychoanalytical texts such as Freud and his sort of early peers, and then later Jung, who I think we're having a bit of social media love in around Jung, or at least it appears on my feed quite a lot. But I think that reading those texts, I see so many parallels with yogic texts, and I've studied the sutras quite in depth and chant the sutras pretty much every day. And I think that for me, I really see those parallels. But I think the difference, or at least something that could be beneficial for the yoga practitioner, is the way in which in psychotherapy, you really get to understand the workings of the mind, the habit patterns of the mind, and continue to create that separation from them. So in Freudian terms, the psyche, the self, is comprised of these three parts. And it's the superego, which is the part that says, you must get on your mat, even though you're injured, you're exhausted, you've got a meeting at 8 a.m., but you must do it anyway. And then you have the id, which is the kind of the more childlike part, which is, I never need to practice. Who needs to do that? It's just completely pointless. I'm just going to, as Tim Feldman would say, sit on this couch and eat donuts all day. And then the ego is the more kind of moderate part that says, I know what's right for me. I love this practice. Mostly it's really good for me. But actually, today is not the day to do that. And I think really getting to know not just those voices and what they mean for you or how they apply to you, but also like, where did they come from? A person's superego is usually essentially inherited from the superego of their mother, according to Freud, at least. So if you have a self that is very self-flagellating, like I certainly do, I'm then thinking, okay, let's look at my parents and look at their relationship to not necessarily exercise, but to themselves, to one another, and what was modeled to me growing up. And at what point can I say, actually, that doesn't belong to me now, and I give that back. So it's not that I think that every yoga practitioner needs to be in psychotherapy, just like not every psychotherapist or therapy patient needs to practice yoga, but they are in a really lovely harmony, excuse the pun, with one another, I think.
Well, we're here to find harmony, so it's good. We'll just
Where is she?
Throw it in every once in a while. Yeah, I love that. I think that's so interesting. I think there's a real fear that a lot of people have, and maybe intense Ashtanga yoga practitioners really can relate to this fear of, if I let that super ego, that, as you explained it, that willpower, that voice of discipline go, or if I silence it, that I am just going to sit on the couch and eat donuts. And I actually think that's not true. I think we tend to come more into balance with ourselves, actually. Like, given the choice, we actually are not programmed for self-destruction. We're actually programmed to thrive. It's all these other little stressors and things in our lives, I think, that push us into kind of the self-destructive patterns, or the things that we do as a form of escape from other stressors or things in our lives. But if all those things were taken care of, I think we're actually programmed to come into harmony and come into balance and into a healthy ego structure that really is here to help us thrive and support us in our life.
Absolutely. And I see that a lot, and I've certainly experienced it myself. It's the anorexic that's very fearful that you start eating and then you're just not going to stop eating, or you start gaining weight and you're never going to stop gaining weight. And I think that perhaps some addictions, alcohol addiction and drug addiction, might not apply to what I'm going to say. But I think that, again, going back to Ayurveda, like attracts but the opposite brings balance. So if you have been getting up like I was at 4 a.m. every day or 6 days a week to practice, when you stop, you probably are going to have a period of time of actually just being super lazy and being okay with it and sleeping tons and eating tons and gaining tons of weight. And that was my experience. About a year ago, I just stopped practicing Ashtanga. And I had all of those fears that you describe of, gosh, I'm just going to turn into this lazy slob. And that hasn't been my experience. I needed some lazy time. My body was crying out for it in so many ways. Yeah. And actually, as you describe, you then come to a point of, you know what, I actually want to do a bit of yoga again. It's not the super ego telling me I must do it. It's actually, now my hamstrings feel horrendous or now I really want to connect with my breath or whatever.
Yeah, we're programmed to be healthy, I think. And it's like when we go into these extremes, and again, it's not to judge the extremes, but it's like you say, if you've been pushing yourself and really disciplining yourself for a long time, you almost have to go to the other way in order to come back to the center, because everything in you is craving rest and relaxation and really needs to know how that state feels and embody that state before you can come into something that feels more balanced or is coming from within yourself as like, I really want to do this rather than I have to do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to just watch the mind and the body and like our fears. And also, I think another thing that's interesting is questioning those fears. What if you do gain weight? What are you afraid will happen?
Nothing happens. Or at least in my case, nothing happens and everything happens, which we'll talk about.
So we often like are driven by these unconscious fears. Well, then I won't attract, I don't know, someone, or well, then I'll hate myself. Well, let's just really question, is that true? And let's look. I mean, if you loving yourself is dependent on your weight, what kind of love is that?
For sure. And I remember being told years ago in relation to weight, like, you're programmed as someone who's had an eating disorder, you know how to gain weight. So why don't you try gaining weight? And if it doesn't work, you know how to lose it again. It's easy. You know how to do that. So, and actually when you've gained weight, oh, okay, it's not as horrendous over here as I thought it might be. And I'm not obese, so I'm actually not healthier.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about weight because it's related to your predicament, your current situation.
Yeah.
Okay, but I know. 1880s, you found yourself in a predicament.
I have.
But no, really. I mean, many women, especially I think in the practice, and many women I know have struggled to get pregnant. And I know that for you, getting pregnant was something you really wanted to do. You really wanted to have a child and to be a mom. What was stopping this from happening?
Well, I think that the first thing that was stopping it from happening was not having a partner. And I suppose everything I spoke of earlier in terms of this self-sufficiency, this schedule that I had, this lifestyle that didn't really involve like meeting people was a big part of that. I lived a life that was very isolated, and I thought, I'm just going to use donor sperm and I'll have a baby by myself. And, you know, this idea that I could just do absolutely everything. And then, needless to say, I did then meet someone whilst I was still, you know, practicing, you know, who I'm very much in love with. And we spent some time together, and he has always been incredibly supportive of my practice and never told me not to do it. But I think I also ended up meeting my partner, who is Venezuelan, so laid back, just really chilled, really creative. He's a musician. And I was looking at this person going, I love you, but you're like this really strange species to me because you're so different to me. And I'm there going hell for leather. And I think just being around someone of that energy was very grounding for me and very helpful. And as you say, Harmony, and this from our sort of years of friendship and you being my teacher, I knew that I wanted children and he wanted children. I'm turning 40 quite soon in the next couple of months. And I just thought, if I'm ever going to do this, like, I'm not going to do it in this body. And yeah, the very long story short is that I'd been trying to gain weight for many years to regain a menstrual cycle that I hadn't had for over a decade. And even prior to that, I'd been on the contraceptive pill. So I had this somewhat superficial sort of bleed. And I'd actually only had one natural menstrual cycle in my whole life, which was when I was 15.
Wow.
And then I'd gone on the pill. And then I was so athletic that when I came off the pill and I was very lean, I just never had a period. And continuing doing Ashtanga, I knew instinctively was not helping that process. And I tried utterly everything apart from quitting the practice. I tried all the herbs and the supplements, and I tried to eat more, but and Harmony, my body, and physically I'm quite Vata, and I just can eat, but I just burn it up when I practice or when I do exercise. It just seems to just go through me.
It's true.
It's rare. I mean, you've also seen me eat, and I love my food, but I practice, I eat,
and you're tiny.
They cancel each other out.
Yeah.
And I was tiny. So I just knew that I needed to stop.
Yeah.
And about a year ago, as I say, I think I'd had a really bad practice one day, and I was like, I'm just not going to do this tomorrow. And I just had a massive break. And needless to say, about 6 months later, my period returned. So I gained a good amount of weight, had a lot more sleep, nervous system was in a far more stable place. My menstrual cycle returned, and then about a month after that, we fell pregnant naturally, and I'm now 20 weeks pregnant.
That's so amazing.
It was quite the fast journey from, I imagined that I would then have to spend a long time getting my cycle regular, and really us really trying in the way that couples try when they know they're ovulating. But we just had some good sex and just got pregnant. It was great. So
amazing. But you really prepared your body and your energy in a way. And I think that sometimes that unconscious fear of, I'm going to have to give up my practice, I'm going to have to change something in my life, and this need to have things controlled and in this particular routine and so fixed, that unconscious fear or knowing that having a child is going to disrupt everything, because it does, prevents the body from, because it feels unsafe to move into that place of unknowing, of having to let go, of having to give up, of having to be in the unknown and something totally new and not have that predictability or that routine or that control. And I think what you're speaking to is also really preparing yourself for 6 months. I mean, you already gave up the practice. You already said, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to rest. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to restore my energy. I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to be in my body in a new way. And all of those things created a sense, I'm assuming, in your subconscious mind of, it's okay. I'll be fine. Like, it's totally safe. Look at me. I'm fine. I'm not practicing. I don't have this intense routine. I'm enjoying life. I'm feeling good in my body. I'm feeling happy. And all of those are like the preconditions for life, for creative energy to start moving and growing and flowing within us.
Absolutely. I think you described that really well, because I remember thinking to myself when I was in that process of kind of contemplation of wanting to stop practicing, knowing that I probably should, but being very fearful. I remember my biggest fear was that I would quit practicing, stop practicing, and as you mentioned earlier, never go back to it, but also that I wouldn't get pregnant and that I've lost it or left it for no reason whatsoever. And that was a real fear for me. I think that ultimately I would be left with what I assumed to be nothing. And I think that what I just kept coming back to was just this idea that fortune favors the brave. And I just kept thinking, I am so petrified to not set an alarm tomorrow morning and get up and practice. Incredibly fearful that therefore, and I think Jung says something along these lines, actually, that is absolutely the thing that I must do. I must do the one thing that I really don't want to do. And of course, I'm extremely fortunate that that was then the case and that we did get pregnant, and we got pregnant very easily and very quickly. But I think that just trusting that even had we not got pregnant, something else beautiful still would have been born out of the bravery. Yeah. It really kept me feeling brave and able to actually stop. And the way that I speak is, well, this was an addiction, because it was. I've had an exercise addiction for most of my life, if not all of my adult life. So actually, I needed for the first time to prove to myself that, like, I'm safe without this, and that, yeah, I can go back to it, but this is not the season for it right now.
Wow. I got shivers when you said that, because I think a lot of practitioners, if they slow down enough to really examine, as you have, I mean, it is an exercise addiction. It's really a question of, like, why are you practicing at this much, at this time in the morning, at this level of intensity? What is driving that pattern? And addiction is addiction, no matter what it's to, right? It's a way of controlling or escaping, right? Controlling how we're feeling in the moment. And usually it's because we're avoiding trying to feel something else. I think it's really interesting that you identified that sort of pattern that's a through line. And even though we'd say, a healthy addiction, it's still going to create some kind of, there's still something that you're trying to avoid underneath it, right?
And, it's a healthier addiction, arguably, than crack cocaine, but my body was still speaking to me in terms of the absence of menstruation. And I think Ayurveda also was a useful tool, in really thinking about this, because Ayurveda really made me think about, actually, like, one of my vital signs is absent here. And with the exception of getting up very early and doing intensive exercise, I'm leading this what I perceive to be sattvic life. So the problem must be in this other thing, or at least, as we were saying earlier, my approach to that.
Yeah. And maybe even just some of the energetic hooks, right? Like those ties, those unconscious or subconscious kind of like things that maybe you don't even have words for, but just were able to dissolve when you faced that fear and had that courage to just let go and just keep letting go, right? And sometimes the fears, even if we don't necessarily put a voice to them or name them, they just then go away because we're facing the fear. Yeah. It's so exciting. So now, 20 weeks in, how's it all going? What's changed for you?
As I said, I had stopped practicing for 6 months, and then I had a very, I think, typical first trimester by all accounts. I was very tired, nauseous, but I wasn't vomiting particularly. And I found it very difficult sort of keeping it a secret, shall we say. I found that, I told friends and family very early, but it was very difficult with my clients, because it's quite significant for my clients that I will be going on maternity leave. I work with people very long term. And I think I entered a different type of space with my client work. And I think it was one that actually was more feminine and receptive on this kind of unconscious level, that whereas before, I think I took quite a kind of intellectual and arguably masculine approach to working with clients, despite the fact that I am quite soft in some ways and many ways. But I think that tiredness and this experience of growing this tiny life inside me in the first trimester kind of just made me say things and experience some emotions with clients that I hadn't really been open to before. So that was both beautiful and also exhausting at the same time. So that was very interesting. And now I look back on it, I'm like, wow, that was really special. And I think it continues to be very special to be working with people whilst I'm pregnant and feeling in this sort of almost slightly heightened, your senses are all heightened when you're pregnant. Now I can smell someone smoking a cigarette, the street. At 20 weeks now, all the sickness is gone. Mostly I feel really good, physically, I feel great. Started practicing again, which has been very interesting after, what had been a 9 or 10 month hiatus. And, I just do some modified primary and a couple of postures from India. It's just an exploration and really interesting to kind of be a beginner again, because, I'm a backbender and I couldn't do a backbend to save my life until maybe last week. And that kind of gives me that beginner's mind again, or that beginner's experience of like, yeah, this is really hard. And also, if I don't want to backbend, I mean, what does it matter? I'm enjoying practicing again. And I do feel fortunate that I'm not going to be taking that anxiety in motherhood, and Harmony, you can speak to this better than I can. But when you have a little baby crawling around or wanting to be breastfed, you're not going to do the whole of primary and half of intermediate, or, a 3-hour practice or whatever it may be.
Not at all. Not at all. I think that needing to connect to the practice in a different way and in a new way and releasing the attachments to it, I think it's one of the most challenging transitions for people who are very enmeshed with the Ashtanga yoga practice, women who are very enmeshed with the Ashtanga yoga practice, because you're the main support person for the first 2-3 years, and your energy and your baby's energy are together for a long time. Even after birth, your energies are together. And so it's not just you doing your independent workout or practice or schedule or routine. It's very much, you start orbiting around each other. And especially the mother starts orbiting around the child. And that can be for 2, 3, 4 years, depending on your situation. But definitely the first year to 2 years, it's very still cocoon-like, still womb-like, And it's beautiful. It's such, as you say, a beautiful, magical time, because it really is a time of, as you say, with the practice, being a beginner. I mean, that's what being a mother is like too, for the first time, especially. No one knows how to be a mom, really. There's not like a handbook. I'm sure someone wrote one, but most of us don't read it, I don't think. You're just figuring out who you are as a human, and then who you are to this little baby, and how you're going to be in that situation. And it's a beautiful exploration. And I think this time of rediscovering your practice is so beautiful too, because you have like a totally different body too. And so it's like you're a beginner in a different body. So you have to figure out what this body likes to do and what it can do. And then after you have the baby, you're going to have a totally different body again.
For sure. What you're making me think about is, this thing that many mothers, have told me, or that I have heard, which is that, when you become a mother, that something dies in that process, and that, there's sometimes a grieving process that has to happen of this non-mother identity from before. And I'm sure that on some level I too will experience that. But I also feel quite fortunate in that I've already allowed several identities, if not one identity, to die in order to get to this point. And essentially it's about murder, and again, I can only imagine that childbirth and labor is actually about letting go. And, and if I was there in rigid control right up until the end, then how's my body going to know how to let go to birth a baby? And how am I going to be able to let go when the baby, is sick all over me, And I think becoming pregnant has almost been like, that was a kind of a trimester, or that was in and of itself, in order to get to the point of being able to conceive. And so this kind of vulnerability that we talked about earlier, the death of something, the letting go has been so pivotal to what I hope will then, make it maybe 1% easier when I do have a baby in my arms.
Totally. I think that's so insightful of you, because it's like these little cycles of small deaths and letting go and surrendering to that process of death and rebirth, death and rebirth. And we do it many times in our life, as you say. But I think this is why also I think the Ashtanga method is very different for women than it is, in a male body. When you're in a female body, I mean, not only do you have monthly cycles, if you're in that rhythm where you're sort of like coming into periods where you can practice more intensely and periods where you can't practice intensely, or you want to rest or you need to rest.
Yeah.
But then we also have these life cycles and life changes that are also very much about letting go and not being able to just do the same thing every day, month after month, year after year. It's just not even realistic because of the way that our bodies are and the way that our hormone cycles are and the way that we are as women.
Absolutely. And historically, I've been very, very angry at men for that. You know, why do they have such an easy ride? And why didn't my partner even have to sacrifice as much as I did in order for us to get pregnant? And lots of thoughts around that. And I think one of the things that I've been experiencing, you know, practicing whilst pregnant is actually kind of a deep sense of gratitude and kind of wonder at the fact that I get to carry the baby around with me inside my body. He has to leave it, but I have it the whole time. And when I'm, you know, doing a posture, I'm like, wow, I wonder what the baby's doing right now. Like, has the baby also gone upside down, or is the baby like rolling around? And I think that experience of I'm very blessed. It's a blessing. It's not something to be angry at men for.
I think you're totally spot on that it's such a gift and it's a power. It's a power that I think a lot of men are unconsciously, subconsciously afraid of, because to create and give life and to be so connected to the source and power of creation.
Sure.
I mean, it's pure magic. It's
absolutely. And to go back to psychotherapy, you know, Freud talked about penis envy, you know, and that we are all sort of envious of the phallus. But then, of course, what came after was this idea of womb envy. Actually, you know, to what extent are men, and, you know, I'm aware we're talking in various binary terms here in terms of gender, but to what extent might men also be really envious of this womb and the experience that fathers go through when their partners give birth? It's a real minefield, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's all metaphorical too, right? Of like really honoring the maybe different gifts that the opposites hold, and then also the union of opposites, which, you know, shows up as new creation and as something new. And what's that sort of third space when we bring two opposites like masculine and feminine together? What's the third space that's created? And that's, I mean, sort of the mystical awakened state that creates new life, that creates a child or something else, some other birth, you know, art forms, great music, whatever it is. It's always this act of bringing the opposites together, which really is, you know, yoga. When we think of yoga and talk about yoga, it's entering into that third space that is the union of what we suppose is different.
Absolutely. Again, I keep coming back to psychotherapy, but there's something about thinking about one's own relationship to that. If I think about, say, a client who has parents who, you know, have always been fighting and are always jealous of each other and envious of each other, you know, it makes sense that those masculine and feminine energies within oneself might also be kind of at war with one another, and that there might be actual war between people of the other gender. So I think part of the union that you were describing about sort of the union of the masculine and the feminine energy within oneself, that can be, I say achieved is probably the wrong word, but that can be accessed through the psychotherapy, through some of these practices, so that can then journalize into the world. So that then, you know, like I said, I ended up meeting a man who in temperament, personality is extremely different from me. And we look very different. You know, he's very dark and I'm very fair. We're kind of this yin and this yang in many ways. And yet, you know, it seems to work because within the yin and the yang, there's the little bit of black and there's a little bit of white, and, you know, and there's that complementary aspect. And I think that had I not understood my own family structure, my own kind of in structures, I would have found the idea of being in a relationship and that sort of union extremely difficult. I mean, sometimes it is difficult because they're human, but I think that it would have been impossible. And as you say, creation cannot occur within war, within destruction. They're sort of the antithesis of one another. So.
Yeah, I love that. And seeing how you support each other, like seeing how your strength or your sort of structure shows up in his creativity, and how his creativity also feeds the structure, and how you can really create that like beautiful yin and yang kind of essence, you know, how it's really this fusion and doing all that beautiful work that you've done of seeing your own patterns, and then also seeing the gifts and the limitations of them allows you to also see the gifts and the limitations of other patterns as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
So if you had some advice for maybe listeners who are wanting to conceive or noticing that they have maybe some addiction patterns to the practice, or afraid of letting go of the practice, or struggling to get their period back after it's been gone for a long time, what would be your advice or your words of wisdom based on your own journey through all of these different experiences?
Well, I mean, this might not sound like the thing that a therapist, and a yoga person would say, but the first thing that comes to mind is just don't do it. I know that sounds incredibly flippant or easy, like as I acknowledged earlier. I do think that for some people, exercise is an addiction, and it is a lot more complex than like, well, just don't do it. Yeah, saying to the anorexic, oh, just eat. It is very hard. But I think that even if one can acknowledge that this is the thing that is holding them back from conception, from, regaining a period, whatever it may be. And then earlier we were talking about sometimes needing another in order to kind of, be brave with you, or even be brave for you. And I would imagine that a lot of female practitioners, might not even tell their teachers that they're not having a period for fear of their teacher saying, oh, you should rest more or you should do less, because that type that we've been talking about, we always want to do more and we want to be seen to be doing more. So I think being honest with oneself and honest with people around, and then, realizing that it essentially is a choice. And I don't think it's necessarily a choice as to whether or not you can conceive. And I must acknowledge my privilege and my absolute luck at the fact that, it has happened to me, it's to me, for me, and that doesn't necessarily happen to us. But I do just think, going back to that phrase I used earlier of fortune favors the brave, do the hard thing. And I'm even thinking about the Bhagavad Gita, you must perform your action without being attached to the consequences. And deep in oneself, we know what right action is, and whether that's for other people or ourselves. So, drawing on psychotherapy, on yoga, on philosophy, and, all of these wonderful resources that, again, we're so privileged to have. I think the answer is still within.
Mm-hmm. I love that. You mentioned a few times that there was a deep kind of knowing, like a pull, that you knew the answer, but you were like, I don't want to hear that answer. I'm going to try everything else until I get to a place where I can't ignore, when like it's my last resort. But it sounds like you always had this kind of instinctive intuition, or this gut knowing, or just this feeling like this could be the problem. Maybe I need to let it go for a bit. And
for sure,
and honoring that inner wisdom, brought you a lot of rewards, a lot of gifts at the other end of it. And I like that too, facing your fear, like really looking at, what am I afraid will happen if I don't do this thing? And it could be anything, right? Or what am I afraid will happen? What am I really afraid of? What am I afraid of doing or not doing? And then going for that.
Absolutely. And I think as well, also recognizing, I think that sometimes we're actually really scared that we're going to succeed. And that we tell ourselves, well, I'm scared to stop this, X, Y, and Z. But actually, I think we are also sometimes fearful of our own power. What would it mean actually to be able to achieve everything that we want to achieve, everything that, Dharma or Karma sort of tells us that we can? And we hold ourselves back, and we get a strange kind of joy out of holding ourselves back in some way. So I think sometimes also looking at that is a different shift or a different lens to look through. Like, why am I ahead of just being happy or being fulfilled, or for me, being a mother, having a family, and that can be an interesting sort of bit of work or a journal prompt.
Yeah, I love that, doing that work around with the part of you that wants the thing, but then the part of you that's maybe scared to get the thing, or what does that mean and what will happen when, and doing the part that's afraid to be successful or afraid to feel good or afraid to be a mother or whatever it is. There's lots of things that we kind of, as you say, hold ourselves in a pattern that's familiar because the familiar feels safe and known rather than stepping into the unknown or the unfamiliar, even if it holds potentially the possibility for everything that we've ever wanted, or for feeling really good, or for spiritual liberation, or whatever the thing is, right?
Well, we're talking about sort of birth and creation, but you're making me think of death, that essentially, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to do it at some point, because we will all enter into this place of the complete unknown. And so practicing the small deaths that we spoke about earlier, why not practice those during life to make that reality of death, whenever it comes, somewhat more manageable and possibly even beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. That's so important. And I think that is what the yoga's for, actually. It's to teach us to maintain equanimity or a balance, even when we're, entering into those small deaths, right? Where we're feeling imbalanced or feeling afraid or feeling dysregulated. It's like, how can I experience equanimity despite my body being dysregulated or gaining 40 pounds or feeling sick or whatever our body's experiencing, but keeping our mind or energy in that place where it's okay. It's not affecting the essence of who I am. I think that's, as you say, helping us learn to die with a sense of ease and grace and peace, right?
For sure. And I think this is the essence of the Vipassana meditation, isn't it? It's just like the embodied aspect of equanimity. If you just talk about being equanimous, it can't happen. There has to be an embodied experience of that. And eating disorders, I've been and I've met many people who talk about recovery and talk about the things that they're doing or the things that they're eating, but they're extremely underweight. And I've been her, and I think it's a real privilege for me to be able to work with clients, especially clients who have had or have disorders with that lived experience. And, I don't talk about myself in session, I have that knowing that I sit here in a very recovered looking, helping you and giving ovary that I once didn't have and that someone else held for me. And that's a real privilege.
Yeah, it's so special. I'm so glad you're sharing your wisdom and your experience and your journey of wholeness with us today, and also holding that space and sharing your courage and your bravery with others. I know it's going to be a big inspiration. So thank you. Tell everyone where they can find you if they want to follow you, or if they're listening and they know that they are also struggling and they want to dip into a session with you when you're not on maternity leave.
Yeah, sure. So my website is katewinter.co.uk, because I'm based in the UK. And my Instagram is katewinter.therapy. As you say, I will be on maternity leave in June or end of June 2025, but feel free to reach out. I'm doing some short-term work with people up until that point, and then I'll be going back to work after I've had a bit of time with the baby. So feel free to reach out.
Beautiful. I'm so glad to connect with you again, and thank you for being here and sharing your journey with us. I think there's just so much richness and so many beautiful insights that we can all do some journaling, some morning pages.
Or if you're like me now, afternoon pages.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I cannot fit in all the things I want to do first thing in the morning.
Thanks for having me again, Harmony.
Wait, before you go, I'm excited to share a special opportunity with you, our Finding Harmony community. This March, come join me and Russell in this beautiful town of Gothenburg, Sweden, for an immersive 10-day yoga journey from March 21st to the 30th. There's different options for you. There's 2 weekend workshops and a full week of Mysore. You can come for the full 10 days or split it up. It isn't just another yoga retreat, though. This is going to be a comprehensive exploration of practice, combining traditional asana with deep therapeutic work, meditation, and also deepening your esoteric understanding of the practice. We'll be diving into possibly some spinal energetics, some somatic practice, the art of back bending and hip opening, weaving together all of the philosophy and practical yoga tools and education you could want. This is going to be an amazing time, whether you're a seasoned practitioner or you're brand new to yoga. There will be something in this retreat for you. So I would encourage you to come. Bring your family, rent an Airbnb. Spaces are limited. So be sure you book your space now. And to learn more about this transformative experience and to secure your spot, you can visit my website, harmonyslater.com, or just shoot me a DM on Instagram. My handle is Harmony Slater Official, and I'll send you a link and you can find out all the information there. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. Share with friends who might find these conversations valuable. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring your magic.
That's it. We've concluded another episode of the Finding Harmony podcast. I just want to thank you so much for doing the work that changes the world, starting with yourself. It truly does make a huge difference. Please make sure you have your automatic downloads turned on wherever you listen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I have so much more magic I can't wait to share with you. Lastly, if you're on Instagram, I love connecting and hearing from you. So come on over and say hello at Finding Harmony Podcast. And you can also come say hello to me personally at Harmony Slater Official. Thank you again for being here. I cannot wait to share more with you in our next episode.